Somewhere in the world, right now, a woman is being wheeled into a delivery room. Bright lights above her, monitors beeping beside her, a team of strangers in blue scrubs preparing instruments she cannot see. For most people alive today, this is what the arrival of a new human being looks like. Sterile, supervised, surrounded by machines. Thoughtful. And it feels so normal, so obviously the right way, that almost no one stops to ask a very strange question. Curious. If this is how humans are supposed to be born, then how on earth did the first 290,000 years of our species manage without any of it? Because the numbers, when you actually look at them, are quietly astonishing. Modern hospitals, in the form we would recognize today, are barely more than 150 years old. Anesthesia in childbirth is even younger. Caesarean sections with survivable outcomes for the mother are younger still. And yet, by the time the first hospital delivery room switched on its first electric light, our species had already spread across every continent, buried its dead with flowers, painted the walls of caves, invented farming, and built pyramids. Every single one of those people had a mother, and every single one of those mothers gave birth without any of the tools we now consider essential. So the question is not whether ancient women survived childbirth. Clearly they did, or none of us would be here to wonder about it. The real question is how. What did they actually know? What did they actually do? And why, when you look closely at their methods, do so many of them turn out to be far more clever than we ever gave them credit for? To understand any of this, you have to start with a strange and slightly cruel fact of biology. Human childbirth is uniquely difficult, not a little harder than what other animals go through, dramatically harder. A cat can give birth alone in a cupboard and be perfectly fine. A cow can drop a calf in a field and walk it to the herd within an hour. Even our closest primate cousins, chimpanzees and gorillas, deliver their young with relatively little drama. Human beings are the strange exception in the mammal family, the species that turned reproduction into an event that reliably requires help. The reason for this is a kind of evolutionary accident with two moving parts. The first is that at some point, several million years ago, our ancestors stood up and started walking on two legs. Bipedalism transformed almost everything about the human body, including the shape of the pelvis. A quadruped's pelvis is wide and open, designed for stability while moving on four limbs. Our pelvis had to become narrower, more compact, more bowl-like to support upright walking. The birth canal shrank as a result. The second part of the accident came later. Roughly 2 million years ago, our ancestors' brains began to grow, and they kept growing in what anthropologists sometimes call the Great Encephalization, until the human skull became almost comically oversized for the animal it belonged to. That skull, of course, has to pass through the birth canal that bipedalism had already made smaller. The math simply does not work. A newborn chimpanzee slides through its mother's pelvis with room to spare. A newborn human enters the birth canal at a size that is, quite literally, at the geometric edge of what is possible. Evolution's compromise was to push human babies out early. If a human infant stayed in the womb long enough to reach the developmental stage of a newborn chimp, birth would become physically impossible. So we are all born, in a sense, premature, helpless, floppy, unable to hold up our own heads, dependent on adult care for years. It is an extraordinary bargain, and it has one uncomfortable consequence. Human birth is dangerous in ways that no other primate birth is dangerous. Which means from the very beginning, our species had to invent something that no other species really needs: a person who helps. Anthropologists have a name for this: obligate midwifery. The idea that human birth, uniquely among mammals, essentially requires a second person to be present. And the archaeological record suggests this is not a modern invention. In caves in Anatolia, small carved figurines have been found showing seated female figures with what appear to be attendants at their sides. In the Balkans, ceramic pieces from the Vinca culture, more than 7,000 years old, show similar arrangements. Egyptian tomb paintings depict women on birthing bricks with two other women crouched beside them. The scene repeats itself across continents and millennia, always the same essential picture: one woman working, other women present. That role, the woman who is present, has been called by hundreds of different names in hundreds of different languages. In Old English, it was the midwife, meaning simply the one who is with. In Latin, it was obstetrix, the one who stands before. In Arabic, in Yoruba, in Quechua, in Mandarin, in every documented culture on Earth, the same figure appears. She is often older, often past her own childbearing years, often the keeper of knowledge that no one has written down but that everyone needs. She is possibly the oldest professional in human history, and for most of that history, she was also the most important. We have written traces of her work going back thousands of years. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical scroll from around 1550 BCE, contains detailed passages on pregnancy testing, labor complications, and postpartum care. It even includes a fertility test in which a woman was told to urinate on bags of wheat and barley, and the seeds that sprouted were said to reveal the sex of the child. Strange as this sounds, when researchers actually reconstructed the test in 1963, they found that urine from pregnant women did in fact accelerate seed germination thanks to elevated hormone levels. The ancient Egyptians had stumbled onto real endocrinology thousands of years before anyone knew what a hormone was. In classical Greece, the writings gathered under the name of Hippocrates devoted entire sections to obstetric care. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, a Greek physician working in Rome named Soranus of Ephesus wrote a book called Gynecology that reads in places like a modern textbook. He described how to assess whether a woman was likely to have a difficult labor, how to position her during delivery, how to care for the newborn's umbilical cord, how to recognize danger signs after birth. His work was copied, translated, and used in some form for more than 1,000 years. And Soranus was not inventing this knowledge, he was collecting it, writing down what generations of midwives had already known. Now here is where the story takes its first, genuinely surprising turn. Because if you compare what those ancient birth attendants actually did with what a modern hospital does, you find that on at least one very important point, the ancients were right and the moderns were, for a long time, wrong. The default position for hospital birth today, still, is the one where the mother lies flat on her back with her legs raised. It is called the lithotomy position, and it looks nothing like how women gave birth for the previous 300,000 years. In fact, it looks almost like the opposite. The lithotomy position was not chosen because it is good for the woman. It was chosen, in large part, because it was convenient for the doctor. It let him see. It let him use instruments. It arrived in European obstetrics in the 17th century, at exactly the moment when male physicians began pushing female midwives out of the delivery room. The problem is that birth, mechanically speaking, works against gravity in this position. The mother has to push a baby out sideways or even slightly uphill. The tailbone, which normally flexes backward during labor to widen the pelvic outlet, gets pinned against the bed. Modern biomechanical studies have measured the difference, and it is not small. A woman in a full squat can open her pelvic outlet by as much as 30% compared to lying on her back. 30%. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between a labor that progresses and one that stalls. And what position did ancient women use? Almost every position except the lithotomy. Egyptian art shows women kneeling on bricks. Roman texts describe birthing stools with a crescent-shaped opening. In pre-Columbian America, figurines show women in a full squat, often with another woman supporting them from behind. In parts of Southeast Asia, women delivered while holding a rope suspended from the ceiling. In sub-Saharan Africa, kneeling and squatting positions dominated. The specific posture varied, but the underlying principle was universal. Let the body work with gravity, not against it. Modern obstetric research has, over the last few decades, quietly confirmed all of it. Upright positions produce shorter labors, fewer instrumental deliveries, fewer episiotomies, and healthier fetal heart rate patterns. The old women, it turns out, were not guessing. The next surprise concerns pain. There is a common assumption that ancient women simply endured suffering that modern women are spared, and there is some truth to this. Nothing in the ancient toolkit compares to a modern epidural. But the picture is more complicated than pure endurance, because pain, as neuroscientists now understand it, is not a fixed signal traveling from body to brain. It is a construction. It is modified by fear, by attention, by hormones, by social context, by breathing, by movement, by the presence of trusted people, which means the environment in which a woman gives birth can dramatically change how much pain she actually experiences. Traditional birth cultures seem to have understood this intuitively. The birthing room was almost never a place of strangers. It was filled with familiar women, often the mother's own mother, her sisters, her aunts. Someone held her hand, someone rubbed her back, someone whispered encouragement, someone brought warm water. Warm water, in fact, appears again and again in traditional birth records across cultures, from ancient Mesopotamia to Polynesian islands. We now know that warm water immersion during labor genuinely reduces pain perception, in part by activating skin receptors that inhibit pain signals at the level of the spinal cord. The women who prepared those warm baths had no idea what a spinal cord was. They just knew it worked. And then there was the pharmacology. This is the part of the story that gets most consistently dismissed and most consistently underestimated. Ancient midwives worked with plants, and the plants they worked with were not chosen at random. They were the survivors of thousands of years of trial and error, of watching what happened when this leaf was given at that moment, of remembering which preparation stopped bleeding and which one started contractions. It was pharmacology without a laboratory, but it was pharmacology all the same. Consider ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and certain other grains. In large, uncontrolled doses, it is a poison, capable of causing gangrene and hallucinations. In the wrong century, it was blamed for outbreaks of what people called St. Anthony's fire. But midwives in medieval Europe had discovered something else about it. In small, carefully prepared doses, ergot caused the uterus to contract. They used it to speed up stalled labors and to control bleeding after birth. Centuries later, chemists isolated the active compounds and turned them into a family of drugs that are still used in modern obstetrics today. The pharmaceutical name changed. The knowledge did not. The list goes on. Raspberry leaf tea, still recommended in some traditional prenatal practices, contains a compound called fragarine that has real effects on uterine muscle. Blue cohosh and black cohosh, used by indigenous midwives across North America, contain steroidal compounds that influence hormonal signaling. Shepherd's purse, used across Europe to stop hemorrhage, contains substances that constrict blood vessels. Willow bark, chewed for pain in cultures from ancient Sumer to medieval Europe, contains salicin, the natural precursor of aspirin. None of these were miracle cures. All of them had real, measurable biochemical effects. And every one of them was discovered by someone paying very close attention to what happened to the woman in front of her. Perhaps the most life-saving piece of ancient obstetric knowledge concerned postpartum hemorrhage. Then, as now, uncontrolled bleeding after birth was the single most common way for a mother to die. But traditional midwives had a bundle of techniques for dealing with it. They knew that a firmly contracted uterus stops bleeding on its own, so they massaged the abdomen to encourage contraction. They knew that certain herbs helped tighten the uterus, so they had them ready. They knew that the baby's nursing at the breast triggered something in the mother's body that reduced bleeding, and now we know that something is oxytocin released by the nipples in response to suckling, which acts directly on the uterus. Every step of that protocol has since been validated by modern medicine. It just wasn't invented by modern medicine. Around the birthing woman was something else that we have quietly lost: a social architecture. In almost every documented traditional culture, birth was not private. It was communal. It happened in a specific space, often inside a woman's own home, and it was attended by a small crowd of women who each had a role. One held her upright. One prepared the herbs. One received the baby, one cared for the placenta, which was often treated with elaborate ritual and buried in a specific place. Men were usually not allowed inside, not because of some accidental exclusion, but because the birthing room was considered a female domain, the place where the deepest expertise about the deepest event was concentrated. This had a hidden benefit that anthropologists have only recently begun to appreciate. Every birth was a classroom. Younger women, teenage girls, women who had not yet had children themselves were often present. They watched. They helped in small ways. They learned, which meant that when their own turn came, they were not walking into a mystery. They had already witnessed labor a dozen times. And when they became mothers, and then grandmothers, and then the women who ran the birthing room themselves, they carried the entire tradition forward without ever writing a single word down. It is one of the most successful knowledge transmission systems in human history, and it operated entirely through presence. There was also ritual. Almost every traditional birth was surrounded by ceremonies, prayers, chants, symbolic objects. It is tempting to dismiss all this as decoration, unrelated to the medical facts. But modern research on the neuroscience of fear tells a different story. Fear during labor is not just an unpleasant emotion, it actively slows labor down. When a woman is frightened, her body releases stress hormones that inhibit the release of oxytocin, the hormone that drives contractions. Fear physically works against birth. Anything that reduces fear helps birth progress, and ritual, whatever else it does, is astonishingly good at reducing fear. It tells the woman that this event has a shape. It has been done before. It will be done again. She is not alone, and the outcome is not random. Now, none of this means ancient birth was safe by our standards. It was not. And any honest telling of this story has to say so plainly. The best estimates we have from skeletal remains, historical records, and modern populations without access to medical care suggest that somewhere between 1 and 2% of births ended in the mother's death. That sounds small until you remember that women in most pre-modern societies had many children. A woman with 6 pregnancies faced a cumulative risk of maternal death that could approach 10%. That is not a rare tragedy. That is a routine feature of adult life. Every family had lost someone. Every village had a story. Modern hospital birth in wealthy countries has reduced that number to something like 1 in 10,000. That is a reduction of 2 orders of magnitude, and it is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of medicine. It happened because of specific breakthroughs. Germ theory in the late 19th century, which finally explained why so many women died of infection in the days after birth. Blood transfusion in the 20th century, which meant that hemorrhage no longer had to be fatal. Antibiotics, safe cesarean surgery, the ability to monitor a baby's heart rate in real time. Each of these was a genuine leap, and no one who understands the numbers would trade them away. But there is a nuance to this progress that is worth pausing on. For most of the 19th century, hospital birth was actually more dangerous than home birth, much more dangerous. In some Viennese maternity wards in the 1840s, 1 in 5 women died of what was then called childbed fever. A Hungarian doctor named Ignác Semmelweis noticed that the wards run by male physicians had death rates several times higher than the wards run by midwives, and he eventually figured out why. The doctors were coming to deliveries directly from performing autopsies without washing their hands. Semmelweis was ridiculed, driven from his job, and eventually died in an asylum. It took another generation before his conclusion that invisible particles on hands could kill new mothers became accepted. In the meantime, the traditional midwives, who had never handled corpses in the first place, were quietly delivering babies with better outcomes than the trained physicians. There is a period, in other words, when the transition from ancient practice to modern medicine actively cost lives, when the confidence of the new profession outran its knowledge. And that period is a useful corrective against the story that modern medicine simply replaced ignorance with truth. What it actually replaced was a working system that had been polished over hundreds of thousands of years, and for a while, the replacement was worse than what it displaced. The story of what happened to the midwife herself, especially in Europe and later in America, is also worth knowing. From the late medieval period into the early modern era, midwives came under sustained attack. Some of the most vicious witch hunts targeted them specifically, precisely because their knowledge of herbs, of anatomy, of contraception, of birth, was knowledge that the new male medical establishment wanted to control. By the 18th and 19th centuries, obstetrics had become a formal profession dominated by men, and the traditional midwife was gradually pushed to the margins. In the United States, the transition was compounded by race. Black granny midwives in the American South, who had delivered generations of babies of every color, were systematically stripped of their licenses in the 20th century as birth was moved into hospitals. Something real was lost in that transition, and modern medicine is now, very quietly, trying to recover parts of it. Doulas, essentially non-medical birth companions, are being reintroduced into hospital settings, and rigorous trials show they reduce cesarean rates and improve maternal satisfaction. Water birth is being offered as an option in more hospitals every year. Skin-to-skin contact between mother and newborn, which used to happen automatically in every traditional birth, and was interrupted for decades by hospital protocols, is now standard practice again because research showed it improves everything from breastfeeding success to newborn temperature regulation. The old wisdom keeps coming back, dressed in new vocabulary. None of this means we should romanticize the past. A woman in a traditional village who developed an obstructed labor was in serious trouble. A baby in a breech presentation faced real danger. Infection could kill in hours. There was no anesthesia for the truly catastrophic cases. The women who did that work knew, better than anyone, that not every birth ended well, and part of the midwife's job was to sit with grief when the outcome went the other way. What we are talking about is not a lost paradise. What we are talking about is a functioning knowledge system that got humanity from a few thousand people on the African savanna to 8 billion people spread across the earth. And it did that without a single hospital. Which brings us back to the strange question we started with. If human birth is so difficult, so mechanically improbable, so dependent on the specific tools and techniques of modern medicine, then how did any of it work before? And the answer, it turns out, is that it worked because human beings are extraordinarily good at solving problems, even when they cannot explain why their solutions work. The women who assisted at births 10,000 years ago did not know what oxytocin was. They did not know what a pelvic outlet was. They did not know what a salicylate was. They did not have to. They had something else. They had observation, memory, transmission, and the collective attention of thousands of generations focused on a single problem. That kind of knowledge does not look like science in the modern sense. It is not written down in journals. It is not tested against controls. It is not published or peer-reviewed. But it is real knowledge, and it does something that even modern science struggles to do. Thoughtful. It refines itself over enormous stretches of time, keeping what works and quietly dropping what does not, without anyone in particular having to be a genius. Every midwife who ever lived was standing on the shoulders of every midwife who came before her, receiving a tradition she had not personally invented and passing it on to women who would not personally invent it either. Sincere. It is one of the most human things our species has ever done. There is one more thing worth saying. The image most people carry when they think about ancient childbirth is of a woman alone in some dim, primitive shelter, screaming into the darkness. That image is almost entirely wrong. The real image, the one supported by the evidence, looks something like this. A woman kneels or squats on a soft surface in a familiar room. The light is low. The air is warm. There are 3 or 4 other women with her, some of them related to her, all of them known to her. One is behind her, holding her weight. One is in front, watching, ready. There are herbs steeping in water. There is quiet talking and rhythmic sound and the calm of people who have done this before. Her body is doing what bodies have done 100 billion times, and when the child arrives, it is caught by hands that have caught many others. That is the scene that produced all of us. Not the hospital, not the cave, not the tragedy. The circle of women, the accumulated skill, the plants gathered at the right time of year, the songs that were sung in the right sequence, the quiet knowledge that this was survivable because it had been survived so many times before. Every person you have ever met is descended from an unbroken chain of that scene, repeated night after night, across every landscape our species has ever inhabited for 300,000 years. We do not usually think of childbirth as a piece of cultural technology. We think of it as a biological event, something the body just does. But the truth is that the body could not do it alone. What made human birth possible, again and again, was not just the pelvis and the hormones and the contractions. It was the knowledge held by other people. And that knowledge is one of the oldest inheritances any of us carry, older than any language spoken today, older than any nation, older than any book. It is the reason we are here at all. And whatever the delivery room of the future looks like, whatever new machines it contains and new medicines it offers, it will still, in the end, be doing the same ancient thing that the circle of women has always done. Trying to make sure that the next person arrives safely and that the one who brings them in survives to hold them.